So, Kiran, there is so much always going on in the world, and we always have a tough time, right? Try to figure out what we should be talking about on our next episode, what's going to be most interesting for our listeners, right?
Yep, of course.
And this time, we found two stories that we personally thought was super fascinating. Which one's your favorite from our picks today?
For me, I think it's the South Korea one, which is very surprising.
Now, for all our listeners who don't know why that is important or why that's relevant, just remember there are two countries, there's North Korea and South Korea. This particular piece of news is about what's happening in South Korea. North Korea is an entirely different story, which we will touch upon in another episode.
So, South Korea, it's a surprise. And on Tuesday night, the president of South Korea, Yoon Suk Yeol, he declared martial law. And that's really surprising.
Yeah, but why is it surprising, Kiran? Why is martial law being declared in South Korea surprising? Let's start with a little bit of context there.
Yeah, sure. So South Korea has actually grappled with authoritarian rule for quite a few years before they actually went into a democracy, right? So when you think about martial law, it's actually kind of bringing back some of those memories. And South Korea is also one of the most technologically advanced countries. You know, you have some very, very well-known brands that have been built from South Korea. Samsung is one, which I'm sure most of us have heard of. And they've always been on the cutting edge of technology, consumer goods, right? So a country which is so forward, you know, has been a democracy for a while.
And the complete opposite of its neighbor.
Yeah, exactly. North Korea is authoritarian. You have one person who rules the entire country. You know, we could use other words for it other than authoritarian, but it's a stark contrast. Dictatorship being one of them. Yeah, exactly. So let's actually start with what martial law is, right? Why it made such a big difference to everyone.
Yeah. It's when people are not allowed to be outside in big groups, they're not allowed to protest, everything shuts down in the country. In fact, the army instead of the police. So normally, you know, you have the police that's supposed to maintain law and order, any country, right? Any city, you look around you.
Yeah.
But here, when martial law is declared, the army gets to do it. And that's kind of scary, right? Can you imagine? They're patrolling the streets to keep order, speaking your mind, staying out late. There's a curfew in place. A curfew basically means you have a deadline by which time you need to get home, right? You cannot be seen out after dark, for example. So this is usually used very rarely in countries like, you know, in an emergency situation when things have really got out of hand. And that's what happened in South Korea now. And we wonder why that really happened. What pushed them over the edge?
The reason the president, you know, as I said, his name is Yoon Suk Yeol. The reason he said he declared martial law is because he said there were threats coming from North Korea, the northern neighbor, and he had made accusations of opposition lawmakers, so the opposition party, saying that they were behaving very anti-state. Anti-state means something that is not favoring South Korea, something that is against the being of South Korea. And so he said, that's why I need to declare martial law, because even the government of South Korea is completely broken down. And so we need a massive change. And that's his reason as to why he declared martial law. And the president has that power in South Korea, right? And it immediately obviously sparked protests. Even his own party members were really surprised because it wasn't a planned move, obviously, from the party. You know, we've talked about elections and all of that in the past. If you remember, there are at least two parties that compete against each other in an election. So even his party was really surprised. And the president just suddenly said, hey, the army is in charge now and we're making new rules that people have to follow. So forget about everything else that you've been used to as people. And this was a huge surprise.
But it didn't last very long, right? I mean, everyone was in shock when it was announced, but it didn't last long at all.
Yeah, it lasted a few hours because, as I said, his party folk and the opposition party people, some citizens, all of them came out in the middle of the night. And they obviously asked for it to be withdrawn, and his own party came in and voted, and the parliament voted, and they said, the martial law will actually have to be stopped because that's the power that parliament has. And so it was eventually stopped, I think, by like 4 in the morning or something. So what started at 10 at night was done by 4 in the morning. So it didn't last long, but it created so much of a surprise and concern amongst everyone that I think everyone was taken aback.
We have wars everywhere across the world, right? We've covered a few of them on this cast. And, that's one region that's always been a little bit on the brink, because you have North Korea, which refuses to listen to anyone in the world, has always, threatened nuclear warfare, has always threatened to go their own way, without listening to any of the other world leaders. And then right under them, if South Korea also gets into a situation of turmoil, then that region gets affected. So hopefully they are going to figure out what's, best for their country going forward.
Yep. And they've all now started a movement to impeach the president.
Right.
The president, basically asking him to quit. And, it's created a sort of unrest in a country which has traditionally been fairly stable. So it's created that sort of, uncertainty. And it's a big and important economy. So, it's let's see how it turns out.
With that, we're going to move on to the second story for today, which we have not told you about yet. But it's another, should we say, ban. I mean, it was not really a ban in South Korea, but yes, this is a big story for our listeners. In fact, right now, Australia has just passed a law that basically aims to prevent young people, that is kids under the age of 16, from using social media. That is a
Huge.
Big deal. That is a big deal. It's got a lot of people who are on either side of the debate talking about this, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and whether it's even possible to ban people from using social media based on their age. But before we get into that, Kiran, tell me, when you were a kid, what did you do? How did you spend your time? Before we had smartphones, right? And that's true. We didn't have smartphones growing up. Surprise, surprise.
I think it's actually interesting, right? When we were growing up, the 80s and the 90s, we used to go out onto the streets. There was less traffic, there was less everything. And we would be able to play on the streets, whether it was cricket or cycle around the neighborhood, whatever it was, no one really cared. And it was much easier to do that. Today, those same streets, you can barely cross the road because there's that much traffic, right? So it's a very different world that we live in. So we used to kill time by playing.
Yeah, I remember, I didn't grow up in a neighborhood where there were a lot of kids, unfortunately. So for me, in my case, I spent a lot of time just reading or listening to the radio or just doing nothing. I remember entire afternoons of doing nothing, which meant, my imagination was always running wild and I was always creating things. And that's how I spent my time. But in today's world, right, and even for me today, when I sit down and I have free time, usually I catch myself sitting on my phone and scrolling social media, right?
Yep, that's
and this
true.
is something we all do.
Very much so. I think the worst part is as soon as we wake up and we sit down with our first chai or coffee or whatever it may be, we'll immediately look at all the messages that have arrived and, all the social media posts that we may have missed over the last 7 hours. It's really important to get there. So I think it's interesting, right? The entire society also has changed because, as I said, the same road where we used to play cricket freely and there was barely one car that would pass by, that same road you cannot cross today because there's so much traffic. So kids also don't have that opportunity to go out and play and, be maybe just in the neighborhood. It just becomes very tough. It's not as safe anymore. So what do they have to do? They depend on whatever else is available. And I think actually I see this even with my kids and a lot of friends' kids is that they mimic whatever the parents do, right? So much. So if we're spending so much time on the phone and looking at Instagram and, YouTube and whatever else, it is something they are also learning as a behavior to try and mimic that same behavior.
It's such a normal thing to do, whether you are 9 years old or whether you are 80 years old. Not all 9-year-olds, of course, but many people have a phone in their hands and they're all pretty much spending a large part of their free time just scrolling, right? And that's what has pushed a lot of child experts and a lot of parents, a lot of educators, in fact, to come out and say, hey, something's got to be done about this. And which is what Australia has done now. In fact, Australia is the first country to make such a huge decision, because it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy because it's prevalent, right? Social media is everywhere. It's used for entertainment. It's used to stay in touch with people. It's used, for education, in fact, in some cases, for information. So, it's become such an important part of our lives.
Is YouTube social media, right? And so if YouTube is banned, can some kid now not go into YouTube and do research on volcanoes?
So that's the thing. YouTube has not been banned in Australia. So it's other platforms like Snapchat, TikTok, and I think Facebook. So all these channels, all these social media platforms have been banned, but not YouTube, because like you said, it is used in schools by educators and teachers, to show kids videos, right? So that's happening. And they also realize that they can't have a blanket ban that goes into effect overnight, right? Imagine today you're on, whatever, Facebook or Instagram for that matter, and suddenly tomorrow you're told, that's it, you can't access it anymore. That's not going to work. So they've said that they're going to take the year from starting January 2025 to kind of figure out how they can transition people slowly into making this change happen, where young people under the age of 16 do not use social media anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is always two sides to the story, right? The more you ban something, the more people want it. The more access you have, the more you use it. So it kind of goes both ways, and I don't know where this will end, but it'll be interesting to see how Australia and the younger folk in Australia react to this.
The other interesting part, though, about this story is that if companies, so the responsibility now lies with companies like Meta. Meta is basically the company that runs Facebook and Instagram. So companies like Meta, TikTok, which is not available in India but is in the rest of the world. It's very similar to an Instagram. And then you have, what was the other one? Snapchat, exactly. If they don't follow this rule, they will be fined up to $32 million US. That's a lot of money.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
Which is also weird, right? How can you leave so much sort of oversight to a company and then, use the law to fine them? It's really weird. I don't know if it's going to work. I'm unsure. I think it's easier if you educate your kids about the use of social media and what should they do and what shouldn't they, what should they be aware of. I think that's probably an easier path than outright blanket bans. That's my perspective on it.
Yeah, fair enough. In fact, educating, young people as well as parents, people who are the adults in their lives, who can then, ensure that this information is being passed on, put the right amount of controls that actually work. Because again, from personal experience, I know that all these parental controls don't always work, right? There's some way or the other content will seep through.
Yeah. And your kid will figure out a way. They're smart.
Exactly. So there's got to be a lot more education. Yes, there has to be some amount of control. But the good thing is this conversation is required. We can't just keep going on the way we are. So it's a good thing to, that Australia has taken a stand. With that, we will wrap up our episode. But we do want to hear from you. Right, Kiran?
We do want to hear from you. Obviously, don't go to Instagram. So ask your parents to send a message on Instagram or on our website.
We always say that.
Or on our website, which is www.takarokids.com, and let us know what you think about this ban. And, maybe that's more interesting than the South Korea situation right now. What do you think about the Australia ban on social media for kids younger than 16 years of age?
And also tell us, what would you do to implement something like this, right? If you had to make sure that people around you were being responsible about how they use social media, what ideas do you have to make sure that happens? And that's it from us. Until next week, it's goodbye.
Bye-bye.